Taliban began in the early 1990s when Afghanistan was struggling after the long Soviet-Afghan War. The country was full of different militias, warlords, and chaos, and people were desperate for safety and stability. In this environment, a small group of religious students from the southern Kandahar region came together under the leadership of Mullah Omar, a former Mujahideen fighter. These students were mostly young Pashtuns who had studied in madrasas along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. They believed that only a strict, disciplined Islamic movement could end the lawlessness and restore order. Their message spread quickly because many Afghans were tired of corruption and violence. As the Taliban gained followers, they began capturing district after district, often without much resistance because people preferred them over the local warlords. The group promised to clean the roads, protect civilians, and establish justice according to their interpretation of Sharia. Their rise was surprisingly fast. By 1994, they had taken key routes in southern Afghanistan, and by 1995 they were already challenging major cities. In 1996, the Taliban entered Kabul and announced the creation of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, marking the beginning of their first rule over the country. Their initial appeal came from their claim to fight corruption and provide security, but their strict ideology and rigid interpretation of Islam shaped everything they did. The world watched as a student-based movement transformed into a powerful force capable of controlling an entire nation. Once the Taliban took control of Kabul in 1996, they began governing Afghanistan according to a strict interpretation of Islamic law. Their rule was centered around enforcing moral codes, controlling public behavior, and reshaping society to fit their religious vision. One of the earliest and most significant changes they made was restricting the lives of women and girls. Girls' schools were shut down, women were barred from most jobs, and they could only leave home with a male guardian and wearing a full veil. These rules were justified by the Taliban as necessary for protecting society, but they created widespread fear and isolation, especially among women who suddenly lost their basic freedoms. The Taliban also established a religious police force known as the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. These officers patrolled streets, markets, and public places to ensure that people followed the Taliban's regulations. Men were required to grow beards of a certain length, shops had to close during prayer times, and any form of entertainment, such as music, movies, television, or many sports, was banned. Public punishments such as lashings, amputations, and even executions were carried out in stadiums and squares, often drawing large crowds. These harsh penalties were meant to deter crime, but they also spread fear and suppressed dissent. Internationally, the Taliban's rule caused concern and criticism. Only Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE recognized their government. The rest of the world isolated them due to human rights violations and their decision to shelter Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. The Taliban believed they were creating a pure Islamic society, but the reality for many Afghans was a life of strict control, limited freedoms, and constant surveillance. Their rule became defined not just by religious enforcement but also by cultural suppression, economic stagnation, and a steady decline in Afghanistan's global relationships. After the 9/11 attacks in 2001, everything changed for the Taliban. The United States blamed al-Qaeda for the attack and demanded that the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden, who was living under their protection in Afghanistan. The Taliban refused, insisting on their traditional code of hospitality and claiming they needed evidence. This refusal triggered a US-led invasion, supported by NATO and Afghan opposition forces. Within weeks, the Taliban government collapsed. Kabul fell, key leaders fled toward Pakistan, and the movement went from ruling a country to surviving as fugitives. But the fall of their government did not mean the end of the Taliban. They started reorganizing in rural areas and along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Former fighters, local tribal networks, and new recruits slowly rebuilt the group. Many Afghans were frustrated with corruption in the new Afghan government and the presence of foreign troops, and the Taliban used this frustration to regain influence. Over time, they developed a strong and coordinated insurgency. They carried out guerrilla attacks, suicide bombings, and ambushes, targeting both Afghan forces and international troops. Their tactics became more sophisticated as they used roadside bombs, shadow courts, and intelligence networks to control territory. By the late 2000s, the Taliban had become a powerful force once again, not controlling cities but gaining control of vast rural areas. They created parallel administrations where they collected taxes, settled disputes, and enforced their rules, sometimes more efficiently than the official government. Despite billions of dollars in international support, the Afghan state struggled with corruption, internal divisions, and insecurity. This instability helped the Taliban strengthen their position year after year. The group also received support from external sources. Parts of Pakistan's border regions became safe zones for Taliban leaders, allowing them to plan and rebuild. Diplomatic efforts to negotiate peace made limited progress. Meanwhile, the Taliban kept increasing their influence across the country, waiting for the right moment. By the time the U.S. announced its plan to withdraw troops, the Taliban already had a strong presence in much of Afghanistan, setting the stage for their rapid return to power in 2021. When the United States and NATO forces began withdrawing from Afghanistan in 2021, the Taliban quickly moved to capture territory across the country. Many districts surrendered with little resistance because Afghan government forces were demoralized, underpaid, or lacked proper support. As the Taliban advanced, local leaders and tribal elders negotiated deals to avoid fighting. Within a matter of weeks, major cities fell one after another. On August 15, 2021, the Taliban entered Kabul almost without a battle, and the Afghan government collapsed. President Ashraf Ghani fled the country, and the Taliban declared the restoration of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, nearly 20 years after losing power. Once back in control, the Taliban promised a more moderate rule compared to the 1990s, but the reality soon became clear. Women and girls faced severe restrictions once again. Girls' secondary schools were shut down, and later, women were barred from universities as well. Most women lost their jobs in government offices, NGOs, and many private sectors. Public spaces such as parks, gyms, and bathhouses gradually became off-limits to women. Despite pressure from the international community, the Taliban leadership insisted these policies were temporary or aligned with Islamic values, but they offered no clear timeline for change. The economy also suffered heavily. The immediate freeze of Afghanistan's foreign reserves, along with sanctions and reduced international aid, pushed the country into crisis. Banks limited withdrawals, unemployment rose sharply, and millions of Afghans faced food insecurity. Humanitarian organizations struggled to operate, and although some aid continued, it was not enough to stabilize the situation. Many trained professionals and educated youth left the country, creating a major brain drain. Inside the Taliban, divisions and power struggles began to surface. The movement was not a single unified force but a network of factions, each with its own leaders and loyalties. Some favored diplomatic engagement with the international community, while others insisted on strict ideological governance. These internal tensions shaped the Taliban's policies, often making their decisions unpredictable. The group also faced challenges from armed opposition groups like the National Resistance Front (NRF) and threats from ISIS-K, which carried out attacks to undermine the Taliban's control. International recognition remained out of reach. No country officially recognized the Taliban government, though many engaged in limited diplomacy for humanitarian and security reasons. The Taliban sought legitimacy, but their treatment of women, restrictions on media, and failure to form an inclusive government kept them isolated. Despite these difficulties, the Taliban maintained control over most of the country. Their ability to enforce security in many areas was stronger than the previous government, but it came at the cost of freedoms, education, and human rights. As the world watched, Afghanistan entered a new chapter, one marked by uncertainty, ideological rigidity, economic struggle, and unanswered questions about the country's future under Taliban rule.